under the theme Reimagining Volunteer. MC for today alongside my friend Emmanuel. Emmanuel, please give your welcoming remarks.
Hello. The time has come. Good day to everyone wherever.
Yeah, Adam, the executive coordinator for the United Nations Volunteers, to just give us his opening remarks and officially open the meeting. Mr. Adam, please.
I would like to welcome all the participants in this meeting that we've been expected since 2015. It's really a unique opportunity to gather a diverse group of not only volunteers, but all the people that are involved in volunteering, governments, academia, United Nations organizations, and all the organizations, national and internationals, that are deploying volunteers. I really am delighted because despite the fact that we're having a meeting which is virtual, which was unexpected, I personally much prefer interacting physically with people. It enables us to have many more people participating in this, having a format that also has regional dimension. Participants can expect a range of different views, perspectives, and debates based on the nature of those participants themselves. We want to really have an honest conversation on what are the challenges today, what has been working, what is not working, and how can we reimagining volunteering to ensure that we really bring a different level of conversation around volunteering. And I think COVID-19, which has really shown the importance of volunteering, and our volunteers are first-line responders, will also be very informative. We plan to have different plenary sessions, looking at the theme from different angles. I really want to hear from all these various constituencies what has worked and volunteering has been an accelerator to the Agenda 2030, and how we can further enable this to flourish and to reach the maximum of the 17 goals in the last decade that we have left. We want to build on new evidence, new knowledge, new debates on next generation models of volunteering. I think there's been a lot of experiencing with it. And as UNV, we want to ensure that we build on those policies. And of course, I'm interested to always listening to new ideas and to learn myself through this process and engage across the world and across the constituents. So really, I would like to welcome again everyone and to officially open this meeting and wish to all the participants fabulous forthcoming days, culminating on a global call to action, which I am sure will try to encompass as best as possible all the ideas that have been discussed.
Wow. Thank you so much, Olivier, Adam. What an amazing speech. And yes, that means that we are officially starting this year's Global Technical Meeting, Reimagining Volunteering for the 2030 Agenda. Are all of you excited? I hope all of you are excited because now, again, thank you so much to Sir Olivier Adam. What a very beautiful name. And thank you so much for your efforts to the United Nations volunteers. So now, let me introduce to you the Secretary General of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies to deliver the opening remarks. Let me welcome Jagan Chapagan.
Very warm welcome to the attendees, because this is a very, very important event. And my first message would be, I think this is an opportunity to pay tribute to all the volunteers from all the organizations, including Red Cross Red Crescent, who are on the front line on the COVID response. The second message is, volunteers, you are the symbol of hope and dignity to the people who may have lost hope and dignity. And the third message is, the most important thing for volunteers is to put head, heart, and hands in the service of the humanity. So there is no better service than being a volunteer. And the people only with that heart can bring hope and dignity to the people. So myself, a young volunteer back in the 1980s, so I have the tremendous respect, the biggest respect for the volunteers. So I'm so pleased that I can be with you here today. The IFRC and the UNB, we are having now more than 4 years of partnership, working together to champion the cause of volunteering. But one particular aspect where I feel we have a real connection is this agenda of reimagining the volunteer that's coming from the GTM 20, and of course our own strategy, Strategy 2030 of the IFRC. And I see a massive connection there, where we are really looking into how can we reimagine the volunteering in the context of 21st century. And now, of course, with the COVID, it has sort of accelerated for the need of reimagining the volunteering. The whole issue of innovations, the whole issue of how do we capitalize on the digital technology, how we can be much more inclusive organizations where all different type of volunteers can come together. Of course, the very important part of this inclusive process is also, of course, when we embrace the technology, we should also not exclude the people who don't have access to the technology. One thing for me, the big expectation I have from this event is, of course, when we discuss a lot, and I'm sure you will be discussing a lot around how do we make our volunteer fit for the 21st century, COVID and post-COVID era. At the same time, I have a big expectation that we also have a discussion that how we also better take care of the volunteers, the duty of care towards volunteers, responding to hugely difficult situations, emotionally difficult situations. Volunteers are also human beings. They also get affected. They also get psychosocial needs. They may also get mental health needs. We invest on having well-trained volunteers who are providing a very high-quality service. It is also important that we have the duty of care, safety, and health to the volunteers. So I hope that this event will get that combination of duty of care for volunteers and making the volunteers ready to provide a high-quality service.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chapagan, for those remarks. And we now know that volunteers are the head. They have to put in their work, their best in terms of working, and how we will all know how volunteers can be taken care of, to knowing that we are all volunteering for a better cause, even as we push towards the 2030 agenda. Thank you so much for those remarks. We are now going to have a short video on reimagining volunteering for the 2030 agenda. Please do enjoy the video.
Wow, what an amazing video. And I'm sure all of you would agree, because I am just more inspired to volunteer. But before we get into this session, and before we introduce an amazing speaker, we will be presenting another video, because, as we plan and reimagine volunteering, we really have to have this process, this certain process, because in everything that we do, it all begins with the plan. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I will be now introducing the implementation process of the plan of action to integrate volunteering into this agenda, to the 2030 agenda.
What does the world of volunteering look like today? Since 2015, governments, civil society, and stakeholders have been taking action for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, people have been volunteering to advance development at the local, national, and international levels. What do we mean by reimagining volunteering? Today, millions of people engage in volunteering globally. Did you know that the majority of volunteering happens informally? Only 30% of volunteering is done through formal organizations. The other 70% of volunteering happens directly between people. Imagine the positive changes we could make if people had more ownership of development agendas and if volunteer efforts were more integrated into development strategies. That untapped potential could be the key to major progress on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Decade of Action. How can you help shape the future of volunteering? We have 10 years to accelerate progress on the 2030 Agenda. Volunteering is one way we can listen to different voices and take more coordinated action. This will mean working with governments, organizations, and individuals. All of us have a role to play to reimagine volunteering. Let's take action today.
Indeed, we all have a part to play in ensuring that us as volunteers do the work and that the 2030 agenda is actually achieved. Thank you so much for that video. We will now have Joyce Coffey from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, as well as Selina Menzel from the United Nations Volunteers, who will be able to explain to us the flow of the meeting as well as the ground rules. Over to you, please.
Thank you for joining us online. We would like to share the meeting outline and ground rules with you. So for today, which is the overall, I'm going to give you the overall meeting outline. So today, Monday 13th, in session 1, a global invitation to reimagine volunteering for the 2030 agenda, we will hear different stakeholder perspectives on why and how we need to reimagine volunteering in the SDG Decade of Action. After a few keynote messages, there will be a live panel discussion around the question of why do we need to reimagine volunteering for the 2030 agenda in the SDG Decade of Action. After session 1, we will invite all of you to stay connected a bit longer as we launch UNV's new knowledge portal on volunteerism, which shows a lot of interesting facts and figures, data, and evidence on volunteerism. There will be a brief demo of the knowledge portal after each plenary session. On Tuesday 14th, in session 2, which is the Global Volunteering Snapshot, what is volunteering doing for the SDGs? We will look at the latest evidence on the contributions of volunteering to the SDGs to date. The session will start with an expository talk about what we know about the status of volunteering under the 2030 agenda after the first 5 years, and then dive into a live conversation about how evidence and knowledge can help us reimagine volunteering. Then there will be session 3, volunteering and the SDG Decade of Action, policy integration, transformation, and acceleration. We'll discuss the different dimensions of volunteering that can transform and accelerate the 2030 agenda and examine how to better link volunteering and the SDGs through policy coherence and integration. On Wednesday 15th, session 4, the path to a post-pandemic future. What does the next generation of volunteering look like? We'll showcase and discuss innovative policies and practices to support the next generation of volunteering. We will also have breakout sessions per region, during which we will go broader and deeper to reimagine volunteering for the 2030 agenda. On Thursday 16th, in the closing session, We will hear feedback from the breakout sessions and close the global technical meeting on reimagining volunteering for the 2030 agenda, with a global call to action that applauds the role of volunteers in addressing global challenges, including in the COVID-19 response, and advocates for reimagining volunteering for the 2030 agenda through global, people, and local action. Now, my colleague Selena will take you through the ground rules. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Hello, everyone. Thank you. I will share with you some important information that will be helpful for the meeting and some ground rules also. So most of the live discussions will be held in English, but we will have simultaneous interpretation available for all 6 official UN languages. Those are Arabic, Chinese, English, French, and Russian, and Spanish. And for the breakout sessions, the simultaneous interpretation will be available for the main languages per region. In order to be able to listen to other languages, you have to download the Zoom application on your device. You can find it for download on the Zoom website. So you install the application that is suitable for your device and then access the session through the Zoom application. You will find separate channels in different languages, and then you can just pick the one you like and can start listening in your language. On how to engage during the meeting. Throughout the meeting, you can ask your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. On the bottom of the Zoom window, you can find the Q&A button. You click on it and you type your questions and comments. And if you're watching the live stream, you can also comment or ask questions by using Slido. You go to slido.com, you can see it here on the slide, and you will see a window where you can enter a code. And the code is Q832, as you can see here too. You will be taken to a feed where you can see what others have commented or posted. And here you can also post your own comments and questions, and you can participate in live polls. You can also engage in the discussion and share content on social media by using the hashtag VolunteerSDGs. You can also use the hashtag GTM2020 and hashtag HLPF, as this meeting is a special event to the high-level political forum in New York that is currently taking place. If you like to learn more about the discussions and content of all the different sessions, you can find several background documents on the GTM 2020 website. You just go to volunteersdgs.org, and in the menu, you can click on About and select Resources. And here you can find reports, papers, and a global technical meeting newsletter that summarizes the daily highlights and key messages of the session. So that should be really interesting to look at. You can also find the agenda, some speaker bios, and answers to frequently asked questions on the website. Most parts of the website are available in all 6 official UN languages. Some ground rules for this meeting. Please note that throughout the meeting, the UN's Code of Conduct to Prevent Harassment applies without exception. And you can find this Code of Conduct also on the GTM 2020 website if you would like to give it a look. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you really enjoy the upcoming sessions.
Wow. Thank you so much, Miss Joyce Coffey, and of course, Miss Selena Menzel. I really admire the work and the volunteering efforts that you have been doing for UN volunteers, for everyone in the world. And I actually, just like what Miss Joyce said, there will be a knowledge portal and evidence and information for volunteering for the SDGs, which I am very, very excited about. Thank you so much to both of you. And now, before we go to our first session, we will be having a brief video sequence, and then our moderator for session 1, Ready, Tavi, will take over. Remember to stay connected and always reimagine yourself for us and volunteering for the 2030 agenda. All right. How are you all? Are you all excited? Wow, just amazing videos everywhere. And before, I think we are minutes away before we begin the first session of this 4-day event. Wow. As I can see right now, there are more than 1,500 participants. This is actually my first time to actually see it, right? Firi, are you there? Wait, I think they can't hear you, but I think Ma'am Reddy is also here, our moderator for this session. Ma'am?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Am I loud and clear? Can you all hear me perfectly? Okay, I just want to be
loud and clear.
Yes,
okay,
ma'am.
that's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, for firing us all up and planting or watering that seed of enthusiasm. My name is Ridi Kabi. I'm a broadcaster, I'm a journalist, I'm an author in Johannesburg, South Africa. And I was just reflecting on how volunteering has actually shaped the community that has raised me. Research shows that South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world. In fact, some academics argue that it is the most unequal society in the world. We also carry the burden of gender-based violence in our communities. And even now, during the time of COVID, we have not been spared in terms of femicide, violence against women and children. And so I share this context to inspire the volunteers and to share my own life journey, that it has been the volunteers, the community workers working together with policymakers that have shaped our communities and that have explored the solutions that our societies need in order to be sustainable and in order to be viable. I cannot imagine my country, South Africa, being where it is today, were it not for the intervention, the work, the spirit, the commitment of volunteers. So this theme today is very, very close to my heart, and I see it as a necessary conversation where we can share our expertise, where we can share our goodwill, where we can share inspiration. But it's not just about that. Our relationships with our volunteers in our communities must be a symbiotic relationship that also takes into account the challenges that they face. What responsibilities do we have as citizens of the world, as organizations of the world, to lend support to volunteers, to recognize all forms of volunteering, and to make sure that indeed nobody is left behind. And I hope that is what will come out of our conversations as we share, as we inspire, as we collaborate, and as we challenge each other in order to tackle and change the status quo for the better. Without much ado, let's get a welcome message now from the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. It is the time of COVID. We all have to be creative about how we connect to each other, how we link with one another, and we can be present in this conversation, even though miles are separating us. Thank goodness for technology that we can have these kind of conversations. So without much ado, let me welcome the UN Deputy General, Secretary General, Ms. Amina Mohammed, to give us her message today.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, a very warm welcome to this special event on reimagining volunteering for the 2030 Agenda. I thank the United Nations Volunteers Programme and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies for their continued leadership in this area, as well as all the partners that have worked to bring us here today. The theme of this year's high-level political forum, Accelerating Action and Transformative Pathways, highlights the urgency of our work as we cope with a devastating global pandemic. COVID-19 has highlighted the fragility of a world that remains grossly unequal, plagued by injustice, and at odds with its natural environment. Yet the pandemic has also highlighted the enormous potential of the human capacity to adapt to change and to support each other. This spirit is perfectly encapsulated in the scale of volunteering that we have seen in communities in these past 6 months. Across the globe, 1 billion people volunteer. They do so at all ages and in different ways. 70% of volunteering happens directly between people, not through organizations or formally established systems. More and more volunteering is done online for a given cause, and volunteering is becoming more inclusive of local, traditional, and emerging forms, especially in the Global South. This is a remarkable foundation on which to build as we face this pivotal moment in the world's affairs. Today, we need to mobilize everyone everywhere to recover better from the pandemic. We need to accelerate implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Before COVID struck, we launched a decade of action for that purpose, and that work is more necessary than ever. We need greater urgency and ambition from leaders and policymakers, but we must bring solutions to scale. The SDGs provide the pathway to sustainable development. Volunteering can play a critical role, but we are not yet tapping its full potential, nor are we always doing so in a manner that ensures the rights and well-being of the volunteers themselves. I encourage you to reflect on these questions, and in particular, to reimagine how people power and people action can bring about the transformative change we need to deliver the SDGs by 2030. Ending poverty, defeating climate change, achieving gender equality, and upholding our core promise to leave no one behind. Thank you for your engagement and support.
That was the UN Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Amina Mohammed. I'm reflecting on her words, and she was quite specific in mentioning people power. And that's what today is all about. It is about empowering communities, but empowering the volunteers as well. And I'm just inspired that there is a recognition that volunteers themselves often work in dangerous circumstances, that sometimes the political context, the scarcity of resources or the inequitable share of resources makes it very difficult for them to achieve their goals and to do their work. If we recognize these obstacles, then we will do more to tackle them and create a more equitable society. Before we go on to our next video, I must just apologize profusely that on our Zoom platform, the Arabic translation has a Japanese flag and is in Japanese as well. So the Arabic language that should be appearing at that moment is not there. So I'm very, very sorry about that. We don't want to leave anyone behind. We want to be a home for all people as we have this conversation. It was a technical error for which I profusely apologize. Without much ado, let us hear from the president of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad, and also the UN SDG advocate, Ms. Hindo Ibrahim from Chad.
Hi everyone from GTM 2020. It's really a great pleasure to be virtually with you in this forum, 2030. And this agenda have environments, economic, social, and inequality, all in the same way, in the same agenda. So there is not oppositions to just to focus on one way and leave the other one. That's a huge opportunity we do have to fill the gap and have a transformative world for the peoples and for the planet in general. But of course, we do have a challenge. Our challenge is the time. We have to achieve it on 10 years, and 10 years is really nothing. So it is really urgent to all the peoples to come together. And that's the role of having the volunteers, because we cannot achieve it only government or only private sector or only civil society. So we have to get all the citizens together and having volunteers for the 2030 agenda that can give us a big opportunity to make the transformative world together. Who are preserving the 80% of the world biodiversity. And with our traditional knowledge, we can come with all the rest of the world to fasten the solutions. And we believe that those who are left behind are among indigenous peoples and peoples in the rural areas. So it is the time now to include everybody in each and to include the solution that we have to build a better sustainable world. Who is the unique on climate change fighting? we are having a biodiversity. And we do have also the raising awareness around the youth, around the women who are coming together in this world. So all of us are volunteers in our life. So we must share these best practices we start together. And this call it a solidarity. And the world cannot be succeed without the solidarities between the countries, developed and developing countries, between the nations, and between the generations, women, old, youth, men, and children. So all together, we can build our better world by 2030 with the Sustainable Development Goals. I wish to all of you a very successful conference, and I wish to meet you personally and accelerate this objective. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so very much, Ms. Hindo Ibrahim. And I think that what I took from that presentation is something that we perhaps take for granted, the relevance of time, that as we set these lofty yet urgent goals, we think sometimes that we have all the time in the world. And she just so accurately and succinctly reminded us that 10 years is a very, very short time. There needs to be action now. There needs to be ongoing collaboration now. There needs to be equitable share now. And another important aspect of her delivery, I think, was reminding us that it is not just about development processes that benefit people. We must keep in mind our planet. We must keep in mind concerns around climate change and sustainability, because without these resources, without this gift of Earth, then our own sustainability as human beings is under threat. I must just clarify before we go to our next keynote that there is translation in Arabic. So that's a big relief. There is translation in Arabic, but it appears, and that's where the mistake is, it appears under the Japanese and the Japanese flag. But if you press there, you will find that the translation in Arabic is there. So hope you can join us and continue this conversation. Let's now go to Nepal and hear from one of our volunteers, Ms. Anju Detau.
नमस्कार, म अन्जु रिताल यासु नेपालको राष्ट्रिय स्वयंसेवक भई नेपालको तराई क्षेत्रमा कार्य गर्दै आइरहेको छु। जुलाई 13 मा हुन लागेको ग्लोबल मिटिङमा सहभागी हुने अवसर दिनुहुने यहाँहरू सम्पूर्णलाई विशेष धन्यवाद दिन चाहन्छु। पछाडी परेको वर्ग तथा समुदायलाई विशेष अवसर प्रदान गरी राज्यको मूलधारमा ल्याउनु समावेशिता हो। सडकदेखि सदनसँग हरेक ठाउँमा समावेशिताको आवश्यकता पर्दछ अनि मात्र दृष्टिहीन भएका व्यक्तिहरू यसभित्र छिर्न सक्दछन्। जसरी अन्य बालबालिकाहरू भेदभाव रहित वातावरणमा विद्यालयमा भर्ना भई अध्ययन गर्न पाउँदछन्, त्यसैगरी दृष्टिहीन भएका बालबालिकाहरू पनि समावेशी शिक्षा नीतिको आधारमा आफूलाई पर्ने विद्यालयमा भर्ना भई अध्ययन गर्ने अवसर पाउनु पर्दछ। समावेशितामा एकरूपता ल्याउनको लागि स्वयंसेवकहरूको उल्लेखनीय भूमिका हुन जान्छ। हुन त यस्तो कार्य गर्दै जाँदा स्वयंसेवकहरूलाई विविध प्रकारका अवरोधहरू आउन सक्दछन्। ती अवरोधहरूलाई पनि हटाउँदै हामीले विविध कार्यहरू गर्नुपर्दछ। अपाङ्गता भएका व्यक्तिहरूको नामावली सङ्कलन गरी विद्यालय भर्ना हुने व्यक्तिहरूलाई विद्यालयमा पठाउन आवश्यक पहल गर्नुपर्दछ। विभिन्न किसिमका जनचेतनामूलक र सचेतना कार्यक्रमहरू ल्याउनु पर्दछ। समावेशी शिक्षा सम्बन्धी तालिम शिक्षक, अभिभावक र सरकारहरूलाई दिनको लागि सम्बन्धित निकायलाई पहल गर्नुपर्दछ। हामी स्वयं आफै गई सरकारी तथा गैर सरकारी संस्थाहरूसँग एडभोकेसी गर्नुपर्दछ अनि मात्र सन् 2030 सम्ममा दिगो विकासले राखेको लक्ष्यभित्र दृष्टिहीन भएका व्यक्तिहरू पनि पढ्न सक्दछन् र लक्ष्य पनि पूरा हुन सक्दछ। धन्यवाद, नमस्कार।
Thank you so very much. So we are being challenged there. We are really being challenged by Ms. Anju Detau to be inclusive, because even within our societies, there are various ways of leaving others out. There are various ways of leaving marginalized and vulnerable communities out. And that is not recognizing the unique circumstances that face people living with disability, that face those that are visually impaired, that doesn't take into account their daily realities, their expertise, and what they have to contribute. So a big thank you to Ms. Anju Detal for reminding us that any meaningful interventions that we make in our society, any endeavor to accelerate the implementation, the achievement, the realization of the SDG will not have any meaning whatsoever unless all members of our societies are accommodated. Not only accommodated, but that their expertise, that their knowledge, that their history, that their experiences are part of the policy making as we go forward. Right now, we would like to hear from our last keynote speaker before we get into our panel discussion. And in a moment, I'm going to be introducing you to our panelists as we explore this theme of reimagining volunteering. And reimagining volunteering not only in terms of technology, not only in terms of inclusion, but also in the context of a pandemic that nobody could have foreseen, that nobody could have known about. What are we being called upon to do so that our goals, so that our plans are not jettisoned and affected because of this pandemic? Let's again stay in Nepal and hear from VSO volunteer, Ms. Prakriti Dungal. Well, a big thank you to Ms. Prakriti Dungel. And as she was speaking about the importance of communication, the importance of education, I couldn't help but think about Nelson Mandela. We are celebrating Mandela Month, building up to his birthday on the 18th of July. And one of the things that he said very early on as we're trying to build a democratic South Africa was that education is the one tool, the one key you can use to unlock the doors to the future. So if we are not inclusive, if we don't take into account the needs of people living with disabilities, if we don't take into account the needs of minorities, then our solutions will fall through the cracks and they will not create the transformative and progressive societies that we want to create. And I also thank her for reminding us, and I use the word humility as I was listening to her, that nobody anywhere in the world, individual or an organization, whether it is a state organization, a private sector organization, a UN agency, nobody can know everything about an issue. Nobody can claim to have all the knowledge and all the solutions to the problems that are facing our world, including the problem of access. We need a little humility as we solve or explore solutions to the problems of the world, to know that expertise can come from all quarters and that there is no point sitting around the table and talking to ourselves as people who are from the same class, the same gender, the same race, the same region of the world, able-bodied. We cannot find solutions if we do not become creative, if we don't bring fairness, if we don't bring principles of social justice to these problems that are facing us. So I just like to thank all our keynote speakers for really succinctly painting the theme and setting the tone for our meeting this afternoon. And it is a pleasure right now to introduce my panel. I welcome Ambassador Neil Pierre, who's the coordinator of the Group of 77 in China and a permanent mission of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana to the United Nations. Good afternoon to you, Ambassador Pierre, and welcome.
Good morning from New York City, and thank you very much for the welcome.
It's morning. You are 6 hours behind me. I'm at 2:45 in the afternoon. And let me welcome Ms. Camilla Sultanova, volunteer at Global Dignity Finland, and she will share her personal experiences, her professionalism, her expertise, and some ideas about what we should be doing differently. Camilla, welcome.
Thank you so much, Reddy. So nice to be here.
Thank you. And later on, we're also going to hear from Mr. Francisco Roca, who's the president of the IFRC. And of course, this is the largest humanitarian volunteer. We are going to open the floor and get as many questions as we possibly can. This is a global gathering. So from Nepal to Burundi to New York, we are people of the world coming together in a spirit of social justice, in a spirit of volunteerism. Let me start with you, Ambassador Pierre. Can you give us a few examples of how volunteering in the member countries of the Group 77 in China is done differently? Are there some unique features that you can share with people of the world? And we'll talk about scaling these up later.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Let me begin by thanking the organizers for inviting us to participate and speak on behalf of the Group of 77 in China. And just by way of background, the Group of 77 in China, of course, has 134 members. We're all developing countries organized at the level of the United Nations in New York, where we negotiate collectively as a group with other partners among the UN membership. The group has 5 chapters. New York is the headquarters. We also have a chapter in Geneva, in Washington, D.C., in Vienna, and in Nairobi, Kenya, etc. But very quickly, the way the group operates, and I have to also apologize for this, we have a prepared statement, which I needed to deliver on behalf of the group, to say very quickly that we are grateful for this opportunity to share with you today our perspectives on volunteering. This meeting, of course, provides an important platform to advance the debate on volunteering, and to discuss ways in which volunteering can support and accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I will submit the statement, so I wouldn't bother to read it, so that it can be part of the records of the meeting. But to your question, there is the documentation for this meeting, of course, specifies that volunteering is done formally and informally. And we can find examples of both contexts in all developing countries. On the formal side, of course, there is always a perception, or usually a perception, that volunteering is from the north to the south. Young people and others, older people, can volunteer through UNV and through UN system or other government-sponsored organizations that send volunteers to developing countries. That is the formal way. There is a lot of informal volunteering that takes place within communities of the developing countries, developing world, as well as volunteering that happens across countries of the South. One of the ways in which we see a lot of that happening now is in terms of the COVID-19 response, particularly through the services of medical personnel that move from country to country, developing country to developing country, and from community to community, giving support in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In my part of the world where I come from, the Caribbean, volunteering is very typical, almost on an annual basis and in an episodic manner. And what I mean by that, we are a disaster-prone part of the world, like so many other parts of the world, where we have a hurricane season that is actually in train now. And when hurricanes strike, you find a lot of volunteering that happens across countries. A country that is affected receives volunteers and people making efforts to support the recovery and humanitarian response in the affected country. So that happens very typically among developing countries, and not only within a region, but across regions as well. We can send, quite often you have volunteers moving from Latin America and the Caribbean to Asia and Africa and other parts of the world. And there's another way in which volunteering is done typically among developing countries, and that is through the diaspora networks. Many developing countries are of course affected by high levels of migration, where people migrate from developing countries and quite often settle in other developing countries or in countries of the North. Many of those people become professionals and they themselves feel the need to give back. And so what we find that is very typical, groups of professionals from developing countries who live in developed countries volunteer their time and services to go back to developing countries and serve and give back to those communities. That happens typically in the medical field, the doctors, dentists, nurses, etc. But it is not restricted only to those categories of workers. We find that many volunteers go to developing countries to build homes, to address housing needs, or to assist in farming and other types of nation building. And so these are typical examples of the ways in which volunteering is done within or across countries of the developing South. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Ambassador. And I do want to talk later about how we can scale this up across the SDGs. But I want to bring in Camilla, Volunteer Global Dignity Finland. Now, we do have analysis from the Plan of Action Secretariat, and it is on progress over the last 5 years. Now, it shows that there's been a lot of consultation with and participation of volunteers in the development process. But here's where it gets tricky. This does not always translate or equate to greater ownership of the development process. I'm curious to know what your specific experience has been. And then we'll talk later about how we shift things and how we undo these power relations that are sometimes an obstacle towards our goals. So just share with us your own personal journey with this.
Okay. Thank you, Ray. And I welcome everyone as well to this. I'm super happy to be part of this journey. Assalamu alaikum, Huba Paiva, good afternoon, Sam, Dobry Večer. I really want to speak on behalf of my Global Dignity family, the community which is present in 80 countries, where we deliver storytelling, dignity-themed workshops to young people, but also people of all different ages across the world. But also I speak on behalf of the volunteers and activists that are right now helping fight COVID, helping fight racism, and also promote awareness on gender-based violence, which is all over the world, is just exacerbating. My experience as a volunteer goes back to Denmark, where I was an international student from Uzbekistan. And for me, volunteering at the time, it was 20 years ago when I moved, but I started 10 years ago. It was a platform for me to get the voice. I knew I have voice, I have rights, I have identity. And I know so do you and all of you who are listening. And that idea of dignity, and Reddy, you will know this just from South Africa, the most beautiful expression of making volunteering tangible is Ubuntu. I'm you and you're me. And that feeling, I go around the world and I speak at around 12 countries I've been already to share the dignity approach to work, dignity approach to education, access to jobs. And so in Finland, last years, we've been delivering this voice methodology to people who are not from Finland, but grew up in Finland, but different ethnic backgrounds. And that in Finland, there's a lot of research. I'm absolutely happy and stunned to be included because I myself seek for the opportunities to be in policymaking where we experiment and where the NGOs are included. So the grassroots definitely need to be much more involved in SDGs planning, design, monitoring, implementation on the city level. And second, there are youth work, professional youth work in Finland. So I'm spreading that also to Uzbekistan, to Ukraine. I was in Ukraine Teachers Conference, which was just so amazing to see. And like Neil, you just said, being from Uzbekistan, there's a lot of know-how going as a volunteer basis to our home community. And that requires the SDG thinking for funding, for being, being in context, for being relevant to our home communities. And it doesn't stop right there. There's actually, I did a Facebook poll right now for asking people who knows what is SDGs. Mm-hmm. So I had 46 replies. Out of 46, 8 people said no. So even though we are online, these are people who volunteers, these are people who are teachers. And I looked at their, social economic standing. So these are people like pretty well connected and know how the world is around. So there still needs to be work done, awareness building, how we as volunteers, even across 80 countries, can really look into say, this is how we know our actions are integrated. Even all the SDGs, they talk about dignity. They talk about human dignity. Everyone should be involved. But at this moment, we're just in a working mode to see how do we try to measure this and how do we align our actions to SDGs so that we're also sustainable on the long run as volunteers, but also as an NGO.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to hear both your thoughts. And I mean, let's just name the elephant in the room. There's great inequality in the world, not just in terms of material resources, but in terms of knowledge as well, in terms of what we authenticate, what we legitimize as authentic, acceptable norms and standards. And in many ways, whether it is conversations around the economy, around innovation, there is a gap between the global north and the global south. I wonder whether you've got any thoughts around the relationship between the global north and the global south, and whether there's any work that needs to be done to shift the power relations, if at all there is a problem in that regard, and elevate or amplify the voices from the global south as well. Because you've got the mic, I'll start with you, Camilla, but Ambassador Pierre, I would like to get your thoughts on that, about the power relations and what constitutes an equitable and fair relationship between the global north and the global south in terms of knowledge, in terms of expertise, and ultimately in terms of resources as well. You go ahead, Camilla.
Right. Thank you for raising that topic, because indeed there is a lot of discussion on how the whole narrative of volunteering should be adapted to the general time that we live in. We're in pandemic for COVID, but also at this technological divide, but also technological acceleration. And NORIC, it's a Norwegian Council on Volunteering, they actually say that we need to confront our cherished beliefs that the only young people going to go from Norway or from north south to like help them. So it's a very negative approach how all this volunteering should be promoted. And that's something that I bring in by saying that if LNOB, the definition leaving no behind, is really not fitting the directive. If we're leaving all the volunteer voices behind, we need to have the representation of different innovations happening in South Africa, in South Korea, in Uzbekistan, in Poland. And so this is really something that's being discussed, and I would put that in to the call for action that how we share platforms for knowledge, which these are really missing right now. There's lots of platforms out there to exchange best practices, to exchange toolkits, but for volunteering, I haven't seen a single one, of course, besides the social entrepreneurs that are running their own communities, right? And the other thing I see that what uplifts this idea of global citizenship is teaching this, making volunteering part of education. So that promotes a lot of understanding and lifts everyone up. It's like, oh my goodness, I'm a global citizen. I'm not just acting in a little community of Helsinki or little community in Soweto. It's a very open discussion that volunteering promotes as in terms of education, professional orientation, and unfortunately, we need to discuss how this. Of course, we need to travel to be there to like exchange practices, but there's also climate change issue. So we need to kind of dose it down and see where is the allowed, use of airline miles, and I don't even know now when are we going to fly. But in any case, there needs to be changing of bias towards volunteering north-south. And one of the examples I would like to bring is not just volunteering, but also the labification of education, right? Where we have lots of labs across the world, from Brussels, Molenbeek, there's R Labs in South Africa. And I always bring that in as an example to the world because they're across Africa and they inspired a lab in Finland to build skills, to build women empowerment, to build coding opportunities. And so I bring that into a social capital narrative. So the racism work of volunteering is undervalued. So that was one of my things I would tell you, and to all of you who are listening, that to help me find my way as a teenage girl from Uzbekistan in Finland, in one of the happiest countries in the world, I had to find my way through volunteering. And that what really helped me is to see that it's building skills, but it's also building your citizenship and identity. And you can bring this yourself and enrich it. And that's where social innovation happens. So I hope that this could be something we can continue and call for action.
All right. And Ambassador Pierre, let's just hear from you on the very same question about power relations. And then in just a moment, we are going to hear from Mr. Francesco Rocca. Go ahead, please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Reddy. I want to start off from where Camilla left off. I think I want to mention three things that I think need to be addressed to redress this power imbalance, as you mentioned. The first is really the need to change the perception that exists. And I like the theme of this meeting, which is reimagining volunteerism, because the perception has continued for many decades that volunteering and other form of development support is about the North helping the South. It's about rich countries and rich people of the North coming to help the poor people and poor countries of the South. Mm-hmm. That perception has to change if we're going to make any progress, because volunteering is about everyone getting involved in nation building, community building, or in putting right the global development trajectory that has been wrong for many, many decades. So I think the change of perception is really very important. And through informal and formal means that we have to set about making that change to ensure that it is no longer seen as developed rich countries helping the countries of the South through volunteering or through other forms of development support. The second point I'd like to make really has to do with the issue of resources and incentives. The incentive structure exists more in the North. Let us face it, these are rich societies who can better support financially young people and other people who are interested in going out and saving the world. It is not at all that young people in the developing world are not interested in saving the world. They're very, very active in that, but they are less resourced. There are fewer incentives for them to do that. In my own country, I have young nieces and nephews who every day go around doing their environmental action to protect the natural resources and species of the country. And that happens across all countries. But you don't hear about it, and the incentive structures are not there. They do this literally on their own and usually unrecognized. And the third thing that I'd like to say, of course, is that we have to also address the knowledge and technological makeup that is essential for driving volunteerism and development in general. Most of that technology, most of the knowledge that help to feed into volunteerism as a vehicle for development come from the North. The technological capabilities of the South are very limited. And so we have to be able to address that in order to help young people and others, people in general who want to volunteer and who are doing so on a daily basis. So those are the three things that I'd like to comment on in response to your question. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And also just privileging the voice of youth and technological advancements as well. And I think if we are to say we are all citizens of the world, we need to look at each other and see each other as equal partners. Let's just hear from Mr. Francesco Rocca, president of the IFRC, of course, the largest humanitarian volunteer organization in the world. And again, we pose to him the same question, the same theme that we are delving into today. To what does it mean? What does it mean to reimagine volunteering, and what needs to change? What absolutely needs to change? We are always tempted at gatherings like this to be celebratory, to talk only about the positives, and thus miss an opportunity to identify the gaps and challenge ourselves to greater goods, to a greater good. Let's
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, dear participants, with the COVID-19 global pandemic, the value of the local volunteers has become evident and visible. This global technical meeting on reimagining volunteer for the 2030 agenda takes place in a time when we, volunteer-based organizations, must put the spotlight on volunteering and discuss how we can better integrate volunteering as a crucial element to drive the 2030 agenda to succeed. Humanitarian crises are no longer just consigned to fragile developing states. They are global and can happen in all countries. And today, all world is faced by an invisible threat with huge impact on human health, but it also carries a number of secondary vulnerabilities and threats, such as the economic crisis, with the risk of loss of employment and livelihood for a large segment of society. As the Red Cross Red Crescent, we have again witnessed the importance of our volunteers and how we, without them, would not have been able to respond to the needs. And I applaud all women and men who put their own well-being aside to help a population in dire need. And this, I assure you, will continue. A global pandemic needs a team effort that brings together the collective expertise, resources, and presence, of course, of governments and community, as well as the full range of humanitarian and development actors. No one can face this pandemic alone, let alone without volunteers. And these volunteers need to become an accepted part of this team effort. So this team effort must also ensure that volunteers are able to carry out their response. Volunteers should be given access to communities, even during lockdowns and confinement. Local and national organizations must be recognized as helpers in crisis, and national decrees and regulation must ensure that these organizations, such as the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, are not prevented from supporting by regulation and quarantine rules. Is extremely important. We have been doing our utmost to continue to provide basic humanitarian services, as well as respond to the needs created by the current crisis, focusing especially on preparedness. And we have managed to onboard more volunteers than ever. During this pandemic, many people decided to do something for their own communities, and this is a sign of hope for all of us. As the world dramatically changed, volunteering changed as well. And we are faced by shorter volunteering periods, lack of trust in institutions, desire for much quicker responses, flatter and direct access to impact, threats to the safety of volunteers, and digital transformation among the trends. And there is a surge in the way citizens and communities are self-organizing and self-mobilizing, which can at times sideline, I would say, humanitarian organizations that are not really ready to adapt. And the Red Cross and the Red Crescent is adapting rapidly to engage with and to support the range of networks and voluntary efforts in society to ensure a much larger and more effective movements of humanitarians. To engage more effectively with the billions of people around the world, motivated to make the difference both in their own communities and globally, we are developing more open models. We offer models of lighter engagement and less control and more action dedicated to providing resources, tools, skills, expertise, platforms and spaces where people can create and implement the change they want to see in the world. COVID-19 pandemic is also confirming the need for rapid progress on some of the transformation, and the FSC network is committed to accomplish in our 10-year strategy, the Strategy 2030. And this includes investment in a digital transformation as well as digital literacy, developing new models of volunteerism, including virtual ones, and investing in trust building and community engagement as the core method for maintaining our legitimacy. And I would like to share only three recommendations from the Red Cross and Red Crescent with all of you. The first, volunteers around the world are putting their life on the line to support humanitarian response and ensure protection and assistance to the most vulnerable. However, a number of national society lack the means to provide the volunteers with insurance, and currently they have no alternative means from public or other sources. We have been supporting them to explore all available domestic means for this. When UN agencies and other international actors enter into partnership with the Red Cross and Red Crescent Society, we also hope that they step up to provide whatever support they can to protect the volunteers. It's extremely important. The moral duty of care to local humanitarian actors, the staff and volunteers, is a vital consideration during this time. All emergency responders and staff and volunteers should have access to the appropriate personal protective equipment, adequate training, and psychosocial support. Those who fail heal in the course of their activities should be granted coverage for their medical needs, and in the worst cases, compensation for their families. But not all countries offer public health care, and many national societies and local organizations cannot afford or obtain insurance to cover those who may contract the disease or to support their family, and should they be unable to work or in the worst case to die from the disease. And this should be considered as a basic duty to the partner organization and should receive, I hope, specific donor funding. The second, governments as well as international and local responders should take efforts to identify communities and individuals who may be particularly vulnerable, marginalized or excluded, and engage with them to design measures to meet their specific needs, to ensure that all people can access the protection and the assistance needed. And particular attention should be made to identify and address the formal and informal barriers to access services and to ensure provision of effective and accurate information on health care, new rules and restrictions, and how to access protection and assistance in forms and languages that will be accessible by everyone. Third, and the last one, in many contexts, local humanitarian actors are not only the first responders, they are the only responders. And this is the demonstration of the importance of continuing investing in local actors to ensure that in the present setting and in the future, we can indeed rely on a network of strong local actors. We must work together to scale up support to local capacity to enable them to provide the humanitarian assistance, as well as to prepare, reduce risks, and respond within their communities. This needs to include listening to their priorities, needs, and concerns, and to ensure that they are able to fulfill their vital roles during any crisis. I really wish you all lively discussion and debate during this global technical meeting. And I hope you end this week with many ideas and suggestions to move the agenda forward. I sincerely thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so very much to Mr. Francesco. He wasn't able to be with us live today, but I'm delighted that the acting Under Secretary General for the Programs and Operations of IFRC, Mr. Xavier Castellanos, is present, and he will be available for our Q&A that will happen and also encompass some questions from members of the audience. I see your questions are coming in. They are pertinent. They are very relevant. We will make space for them as well. Just very quickly, he mentioned 3 challenges. I'll call them challenges because it means that we must rise to the occasion. He talked about compensation, medical coverage, insurance, just to summarize, saying that we have a moral duty. There's a moral duty to provide for the volunteers. The second thing that he says that really resonates is that we must go where people are. And the words that he used was identifying vulnerable communities and engaging with them at that level. It's all very well to have copious amounts of research, to sit in our comfortable offices and do research and treat our communities as an anthropological curiosity or study. But if we're not going where people are, then we will miss them. And going there with our money, with our goodwill, with our help. But here's another important one, saying that local humanitarian volunteers are often the only respondents in a time of crisis. Doesn't this link in with what you said when you opened, Ambassador Pierre, about how communities become self-sufficient and self-reliant? Sometimes they are the only people there to respond to a particular period or a particular episode. What are your thoughts then about what this means for the future? What should we prioritize? What are the key policy asks in your point of view?
I'm sorry. I had some trouble unmuting my microphone. But I really want to continue from where I left off earlier. I think the first thing that we need to tackle is the policy environment. In terms of the way forward, there has to be a way that that actions of volunteerism and community effort to build their community and society must be embedded in policy, in a policy framework, whether it's at the local, national, regional, or global levels. It is very, very important to have the right policies to structure and incentivize volunteer work across societies. Now, the other thing, of course, that I mentioned earlier on is about the incentive structure. Resources, and I believe the last speaker spoke to this also, resources have to be put in place to support volunteers. Volunteers risk their lives and risk their health, etc., to go out and work for the good of community or society. But they cannot do this without material support. And so we have to find a way to be able to provide the resources that are needed for them to be able to do their work properly, and to provide the incentives to encourage others, younger people, older people, and everyone in between, who may have an interest but really cannot take that initiative to move forward to volunteer because the resources are just not available to them. And so I think these are the 2 things I would say: address the policy and environment, and find a way to sort of mobilize and put resources and incentive structures in place. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And you, Camilla, before we go to our audience members, just really finding and exploring ways from a policy point of view to make sure that, volunteering is positioned as a key accelerator of change. Your thoughts? Camilla, are you still with us?
Can you hear me?
Very good. Yes, I can. I hope you got my question, though.
I did, yes. Thank you, Moderator Reddy. And as Ambassador Pierre says, that policymaking has a lot to do with that. And being in Finland, we have been part of the first policymaking to address youth social inequality last year, called Citra Lab. And to all the present here, I would recognize and recommend working on OECD level. They just launched Observatory for Public Innovation, where at this moment of the hour, every person from every part of the planet can write in what are the new approaches to volunteering or to civic engagement or to help fight COVID, can write there and be part of that community. And so they are trying to see what are the ways to experiment so that policymaking is not that rigid, that we break the silos and make actually volunteers and nonprofits and grassroots as real official stakeholder in every stage of SDG planning, monitoring, implementation. I have seen that right now, solidarity, community resilience, volunteering, they are like the watchword of the century. And for all the 1 billion people that know right now volunteering, I find this accountability issue to not represent volunteers inside this high-level political forum, that is not enough volunteering as recognized stakeholder in national reviews. So I think it was only 8 out of close to 50 countries have encouraged. And one of the best examples, actually, Brunei, a small country. They put a lot of effort to put out where volunteering is accelerating their SDGs locally in Brunei. So in Finland and Denmark, there's a high awareness of SDGs among young people. In Uzbekistan, they just made a report that only 60% heard it for the first time. So there is a room for improvement to see not only awareness among the audience, but we are 1 billion people. And let's not forget the monetary value of volunteering that has already been measured. And if I can just take 1 minute, I need to say this monetary value here. In Finland, monetary value of volunteering is 3 billion euro, which is 1.8% of GDP. In New Zealand, it's 2.3% of GDP. In Japan, 1%, Belgium, 0.8% of GDP. So imagine you were a business, how many incentives you would get if you did bring so much growth to economies. And so I think we have the call for action to say that how we're going to have the representation. So leaving no one behind becomes leaving no volunteer behind, no volunteer contribution behind. So, and that comes to our also global dignity workshops that we do. We promote dignity to every student, teacher, immigrants here in Finland, Uzbek young boys and girls in Uzbekistan. So there is a lot of potential to show that policy making is not just for people within that sphere, and we should make ownership much more clear because we're already there and these things are happening. We just have to share it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm so glad that you spoke about, you touched on the migrant community, because we do have a question, and I would like at this point for Mr. Xavier Castellanos, the Acting Undersecretary General for Programs on Operations of IFRC, to prepare himself, because I'm directing this question to you and welcoming you in that way to our panel, to our Q&A. We have a question from a member of the audience, Mr. Baltazar Baccinoni, and he is with the Burundi Red Cross for so it is for you, Mr. Xavier. And here's the question. The role of migrants as volunteers in communities, how can we offer them equal opportunities to volunteer? And I have no doubt that this topic, this theme, is also very, very close to Ambassador Pierre and Camilla's hearts, but we'll give it to you, Mr. Xavier.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Such an important question that has been raised. First of all, migrant community bring with them their own culture, in many cases their own language, and also their own customs and way of living. Their behaviors and their way of beliefs and seeing the world is absolutely different. And their living conditions are also absolutely different. Therefore, creating and enabling conditions for volunteering of migrant communities is absolutely essential. In these migrant communities, being these refugees, if we don't work with migrant communities, we are just missing a significant number, a significant percentage of the needs of people in communities. Many times the access to the communities have different barriers, and those barriers are not necessarily where the migrant has moved, but also what are the migrant line of thinking is in terms of feeling safe, feeling trust, knowing which institutions to work. So it's of essential matter to have organizations that open the arms to bring to migrant communities the opportunity to do volunteering work. And at the same time, if I put you a practical example in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, our key component of our work at the camps where we have over 1 million of refugees are people from their own camps that are part of their own communities and understand the dynamics and power relations. Our work is to ensure what are those power relations, how to ensure that those power relations do not translate into issues of power abuse, but rather into opportunities to ensure that the humanitarian needs and the needs of the people of migrants, of being any individual who is in need, is properly addressed. So this comes with issues of protection. It comes with issues with the capacity to ensure proper community engagement and ensure proper dialogue with the communities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And just as a follow-up question there, Mr. Xavier Castellanos, I mean, I can't help but use my own country as a case study. It's a very shameful chapter in the history of South Africa, how we've seen some xenophobic violence that was specifically targeted at African migrants. And it got even worse. A whole lot of migrants who are very enterprising and entrepreneurial. They're starting small businesses in townships. And for a while, there's harmonious living. The customers are coming, but out of the blue, whether as a political tool, there'll be some violence that just erupts where the migrants are positioned as people who are a threat to local jobs. I mean, it's universal. Let's look at what's happening in the United States now, the anti-immigrant type of policy. We won't get into that for now. But I guess the question that I'm going into based on your answer is, whose job is it to create those kinds of partnerships with migrant communities? And the reason I ask that is that in South Africa, the migrant communities have shown themselves to be entrepreneurial. I can just imagine that when we use our imagination as policymakers, you could actually form partnerships where they share their skills with local communities, mentorship, training, and so on. It just requires a level of imagination. How do you see potential for driving or formalizing that kind of process? Because some happen spontaneously, but in some instances, it perhaps need formal leadership to step in and say, this is how we are going to work with different communities in our society. Your thoughts?
Yeah, very important question. You know, we always talk about how do not harm when we work in communities. And normally what you have is connectors or dividers. And something that happens within community, host communities that see that migrant communities are the ones who receive the humanitarian aid feel themselves excluded. Mm-hmm. So it's a critical component in the planning in terms of how to address the needs of migrant communities, for example. What is the role of host communities and how those host communities can really establish partnership at local level? And in that regard is, what are those connectors? What unite host communities and migrants? For example, if you go to a market, the market unite them, and how to use those connectors that unite them to establish conditions of creating trust. Because the key component here is when host communities feel themselves excluded, their immediate reaction is, I don't trust on those institutions, I don't trust in these migrants, I don't have acceptance, I will not accept these conditions. But if organizations such as the Red Cross, Red Crescent, the UN, but governments specifically, make sure that their policies ensure that both host communities and migrant communities will have access and will have conditions of connection between themselves, will definitely reduce the potential of harming the relation. So partnership will be possible only if we use more connectors in the work with communities and lesser dividers in communities.
Very, very inspirational indeed. Camilla, do you have any thoughts on that particular theme? And also just thinking about, women in particular. My environment is filled with women volunteers, and I'm sure that is the picture globally. And any unique or specific interventions or acknowledgements that are needed in that regard?
Yeah, I think we're looking at the question of intersectionality, that we have a lot of women volunteering by the virtue of gender and, this idea of social norms that perpetuating sometimes social inequalities, and that affects less men to take on volunteering opportunities. And UN Women Head was saying that the women, 56 or 57% of women volunteer on a global scale, and they're $11 trillion, which is 9% of global GDP. And how do then we share also that narrative, say, well, both boys and girls should volunteer. Volunteering is for everyone, for different intergenerational links and other different stakeholder groups, also for people with disabilities. But for in Finland, if I can tell you, I'm a part of two communities. One for immigrant communities, promoting diversity through sports. So breaking that stereotype and building character and skills and empowerment through that. And the second one is neighborhood mothers. So it's all about professional orientation, finding hobbies, and they come a lot of times these immigrant women come from countries where decisions are made for them. So I think that volunteering is about this equality, building that Nordic idea of what is Nordic understanding of equality, trust, the happiest countries in the world, So they kind of get this under the skin with that level. Now, to migrant question, so I'm an immigrant myself, so there has been a lot of discussion since 2015. And the understanding, there is thing to explain. So yes, volunteering is as professional as unpaid work. That's one I heard from a Red Cross workshop in English. And volunteering should be offered in every language. And I mean, also in English language, if we have migrants not speaking the native language yet, because it's a trampoline. Yet, if on the one hand, we have volunteers and migrants get the social capital, and that's very important element to use in the narrative of promoting volunteering as a bulk of economic growth. World Bank, by the way, have a very good framework around it. That if you have volunteers opportunities for immigrants, there are a lot of peer-to-peer networks. There's lots of funding from the Finnish state. But if you don't include them on the job market later, it will going to grow even more inequality. And that's not fair, right? So we have the moral obligation on one hand to offer opportunities, because this is the only platform for raising voice for underrepresented groups. And the second thing is to still make job market accessible. And that is we're fighting with unconscious bias, fighting with racism towards people of color, towards people of African descent, towards people who are Roma and LGBT, with all these different backgrounds. So there still needs to be work to do with protecting the civic rights and civic engagement as social capital building as well. But also the second thing is to make sure that these policy-making experiments are involving volunteers to make sure that the job market reforms, which is happening everywhere right now, they also reflect that idea that we cannot promise false promises to people who volunteer, but they will never be included in the job. So, but on the good note, I actually have this beautiful example in Finland where I work in Hanke School of Economics. So taking the dignity perspective to let Finnish companies tap into social capital of volunteering by looking at mentoring and volunteering their time with international students, because that drives measurable impact. Let's say it's about talent attraction, talent recruitment, and talent retention. And it's tens of thousands of euros cost to employ one personnel and hundreds of thousands of euros to lose that personnel. So right now, to fit for the 21st century volunteering, I recognize and recommend all to think, where do you build skills and how do you promote your talents and all the volunteers that social capital is the narrative to use, because I believe in business and business corporations with NGOs.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so very much. Okay, we do have questions from our audience, and it wasn't just, it is about reimagining volunteerism. I think I will go to a question from retired Ambassador Letitia Maui from Fiji. I wonder if she's in the audience and wants to ask the question herself, or if she'd prefer for me to summarize it. But if she's here and she can hear me and her sound is clear, Ambassador, are you ready? Are you ready with your question? I'll just give it a few more seconds. Ambassador Maui, are you ready with your question? Okay, I'll just ask the question on her behalf. There are various forms of volunteering. Often the volunteer work for formal organizations is much easier to quantify than direct and informal volunteering. I think we spoke quite critically about that. And she says, despite the visible trends and evidence of informal volunteering having made a profound impact, as we've all been saying, on the lives of local communities. Now, we all say that we need to quantify the impact of informal volunteering, but she's asking a specific question. How do we do that? How do we quantify the impact of informal volunteering? And of course, give these informal volunteers a greater voice and visibility in the upcoming decade of action. Ambassador Pierre, do you want to take that one?
I'll give it a good try. A lot of there's a lot of volunteering that happens at the informal level, and I think we all acknowledge that. The problem is, of course, quantifying and acknowledging it. But I think it goes back to two things, one of which I said earlier on. First of all, the policy environment has to be established if it doesn't exist. And within that policy environment, there has to be a built-in mechanism or mechanisms by which you can then know, identify, and quantify where volunteering is taking place at an informal level. And that could be within countries and across countries. There's a lot of volunteering that happens informally across countries even. But if that policy environment is not there, there will be very little way to identify it and quantify and record it so that you can then acknowledge it and measure it. The second thing, of course, has to do with leadership. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a very important responsibility for leaders, whether leaders at the community level or the national governmental level, or at the organizational level, that leaders have a responsibility to send the right messages, whether it's about migrant communities that are seeking to establish themselves in another society, or people volunteering on a temporary basis across countries. Leaders have a very important responsibility to send the messages that we are an open and welcoming society. We will embrace everyone for the value of what they bring to helping our nation or our community to prosper. And so the messaging is a key responsibility for the leadership of any society. And the third point I want to make, of course, is that within the group of 77 on China, we have an established way principle and a concept that we pursue, and that is South-South cooperation. And I want to make this point that South-South cooperation is very, very important for us because we are about developing countries, helping developing countries. And so within that, there are some key mechanisms that we use to promote South-South cooperation. One of those is, of course, the Caracas Program of Action. And I encourage our listeners to research and look up what is the Caracas Program of Action. And there's a specific initiative called the Perez Guerrero Trust Fund, where there's some seed capital that you can apply and obtain some seed capital funding for various initiatives. But these are ways in which, from the Group of 77 perspective, we take this very seriously, and we try to put in place some mechanisms, however small those contributions are, to help to promote this kind of cooperation and collaboration, but also to be able to quantify actually what happens on the ground. I hope I've been clear enough, and I want to thank you for the opportunity, of course, to speak on behalf of the Group of 77. Thank you.
Thank you for your valuable contribution. And I must say, we've got some fabulous questions from our audience members, and I hope we will have time to deal with those. But I do want to welcome at this moment Mr. Achim Steiner, who is a UNDP administrator. And as the head of UNDP, there are certain insights and ideas that we would like to get from him. But just to give you a warm welcome and also to summarize, we've had an hour of great conversations, hearing about the role of migrants as volunteers, talking about recognizing the many forms in which volunteering happens in our society, but also challenging ourselves as citizens of the world to be more inclusive to minority groups, to people living with disability, to vulnerable local communities. And we also got other messages that are very challenging about our moral duty, the moral duty of organizations and policymakers and funders, as it were, to provide volunteers with the insurance that they need, the compensation, the medical coverage, and to go to the vulnerable communities and engage them where they are. That's just a summary of some of the themes that we have explored here, Mr. Steiner. But we welcome you, and I would like to get your thoughts on how you reimagine volunteering. What do we mean? What are your insights when you hear the theme reimagining volunteering? But in answering that, take us to your work as the UNDP, your work on innovation and whole society responses, and what the UNDP can do to mobilize partners to be mindful of the different types of volunteers and lend support where it is needed.
Eddie, thank you so much for your kind words, and I'm sorry I was only able to join you just now, but I was in another event. But I wanted to be very much part of this discussion because, let me tell you, I consider myself to be the #1 fan, first of all, of United Nations volunteers, because UNDP has had the privilege to host UNB and continues to do so. And not only in terms of providing UNDP's platform for the idea of voluntarism and a United Nations volunteers program to be able to operate, but also because every day across the world, first of all, UNVs are an integral part of our teams that are working in 170 countries right now to assist on the challenges of development. And I begin by making the link from the United Nations volunteers to the broader question of volunteering. And you said today's session is about reimagining volunteering. And I think perhaps, if I may use a slightly rhetorical question first, maybe we need to also rediscover the immense power and value of volunteering. Sometimes in our fast-moving world today, the attention of media, of economic indicators, of the policy agendas tend to focus on the formal sectors of our economy. And yet in our communities, in our societies, in our nations, and Niels Pierre just referred to it as well, in the South, as much, if not more than even in the North of the so-called development world, there is a very clear and acute sense that volunteering is both something that has to do with the actual activity that a volunteer can do, but it is also embedded in the ethos, in the spirit, and in the power that it brings to a sense of community, that I think we do need to rediscover the centrality of that spirit. And let me share with you, having lived through the pandemic here in New York City, it has been an eye-opener to me also how in the most extreme moments of the epidemic, the pandemic hitting New York, what we saw was an explosion of volunteerism, whether it is in my street, in the neighborhood, in the city as a whole. Tens of thousands of people volunteered. In fact, so many offered their services that the structures and the systems were not actually able initially to manage that spirit of volunteerism. So the power in people's individual motivation to contribute with their energy, with their skill sets is very much alive. And I think sometimes we tend to neglect that resource for development. Mm-hmm. In a developing country context, that often can be even more acute because the ability of government institutions, of social services, or of indeed other parts of public functions to reach everyone is often still something that is a deficit, that is part of the development process. And often volunteers, be it young people, and very often it is young people also who are at the forefront of volunteering, whether it is elders, whether it is teachers, whether it is spiritual leaders in our community, that ability to mobilize and to direct the power of volunteerism is extremely important. And yet, in terms of reimagining volunteering, perhaps in the 21st century, but also in the world that we live in today, I think carries with it another dimension. Volunteers very often step in where perhaps either public systems or community systems are not yet ready to. And one of the areas clearly is also the domain of technology. Our younger generation is growing up with a ubiquitous set of possibilities in one part of the world, and yet in other parts of the world, even access to broadband, the digital infrastructure is still extremely constrained. One of the things that we in UNDP have very much put at the forefront of our thinking about the future of development is how can we quickly close that gap, first of all, in access to digital technologies. Just to take one example, and I don't want to reduce it at all to a technology discussion, but it is perhaps in the midst of this pandemic, one of the acute reminders of what can make an extraordinary difference. Volunteers are the front line, but also often the pioneers of being able to introduce into their communities new possibilities. It is sometimes simply people getting together, organizing themselves and taking up a challenge. And on other occasions, it is also being part of a organized volunteering platform or indeed a national program. And I think one of the things about reimagining volunteering in the 21st century is beyond discovering, rediscovering its potential is also to focus on how can we accelerate the capacity of people who are willing to contribute to their community to be given perhaps the skills, the access to the infrastructure that can support them, being embedded in a learning network, and therefore being able to much more quickly be able to deploy that energy and capacity with the right training and with the right skill set. And I think in the context of the SDGs and of sustainable development, we also, as UNDP, see ourselves as being part of the ecosystem that can enrich the world of volunteering. Our role principally is to help countries through their governments to look at more systemic responses. And whether it is the focus on, for instance, at this moment in time, the fact that over 1.2 billion school children are locked out of their schools. There is no digital possibility for most of them, but in returning to schools, when they hopefully reopen, can we also envisage a massive advancing in terms of connecting schools to broadband? But for that, we will need volunteers from our community. We cannot train enough people to be able to support such a massive response. But we could leverage volunteers very much in being part of this effort. Mm-hmm. But it is also, and I end with this, the voice of those who work in our communities that we need to be able to draw on in guiding our own thinking about innovation. The work that we do with accelerator labs, these are the kind of innovation teams that we have inserted in 60 country teams of UNDP, are very much working in Argentina, for example, also with the question of volunteerism and how to be able to help governments and volunteer organizations to reimagine their collaborative role in moving forward. So let me stop here, but these are just a few reflections on the centrality and also the accelerator framework or matrix that our colleagues are discussing this morning.
Thank you so very much. We really appreciate that one, and the stark reminder about the deficit that exists and the possibility of leaving so many people behind in this time of COVID, as technology becomes so crucial as to determine which child from which community learns and which one doesn't learn. So we have to think seriously about that. I do want, before we wrap up, we are running out of time. I did say earlier we've had some fabulous engagement and questions from our audience members. I would like to go now to Ms. Alexandra Infante from social lab called Ikigai in Peru. Are you with us, Alexandra? Are you ready with your question?
Yes, I'm ready with my question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. The speakers have mentioned the importance of having a policy, resources, and incentive. However, there are countries that are still far from that. What could be the starting point to do so? Who should be accountable for these actions? Thank you.
Okay. And anyone in particular who is ready to answer the question?
Well, if you want, I can start with the. I think for the question, it's important to create national platforms for volunteering. By creating national platforms for volunteer linking and bringing together volunteer groups, start developing laws and regulations that will promote the incentives for the work of volunteers. One way to go ahead. Several countries have done that, have created their own national platforms, and I would encourage to our colleagues from Peru that the way forward is this is exactly the kind of volunteering. If that is the passion, let's move the passion into that. Go to different networks of volunteers and try to create this national platform. And with that national platform, when we talk about recognition, you can really invest in what are the types of recognition also that we have seen in different laws across the world around a recognition for volunteering. So there is a lot of work done already in that regard. So my advice would be the option is start with the national platform.
Okay, all right. Thank you so very much. Lots of questions just coming through. I think we did deal with this one, but it wouldn't hurt just before we close to ask it, precisely because when we finish this meeting here today, we need to be able to take some of the suggestions, some of the challenges, whether individually or collectively, in how we reimagine volunteering, and particularly for our panelists who have just joined us. Professor Matt Bailey-Smith, who is from Northumbria University in the UK, is asking any panelist to speak to this. And I know it's a theme that is close to your hearts as well, Ambassador Pierre and everybody else. Says research we are doing on volunteering by young refugees in Uganda shows that government and donors often use ideas of volunteering that come from Europe and America, and that this can negatively impact the ideas and experiences of volunteering rooted in young African lives. Do the panel agree that we need to decolonize understandings of volunteering and develop more inclusive approaches? And if so, what do they think we can do to achieve this? Now, I said that we dealt with this briefly earlier. I'm going to it deliberately because what stands out for me is not only using the ideas from Europe and America, so that power relation, but what he says here, I think, is instructive, that it is the impact of that is also discouraging to young African lives. And if we want to bring in young volunteers, and as you've just said, then the last thing that we want to do is to discourage them. Who wants to tackle that one for us?
I'd like to jump in here, Reddy. Sure. I think this is a very revealing contribution that we just got from the professor, because I get the sense that it's backed up by evidence through research and analysis. And yes, what we end up doing, we spoke earlier on when I spoke, we spoke about the need to change perception. Unfortunately, it's more than changing perception. It's addressing the reality, a reality that results in the devaluing of local content, local contribution, and the valuing of anything that comes from abroad. And it fuels this perception, of course, that volunteerism is about the North giving to the South, about people with knowledge from the North bringing their knowledge and resources to people from the South who lack it. And that is very far from the truth. While there is knowledge in the North, there's an abundance of local and community knowledge in the South that is quite often devalued. And I spoke also about the leadership factor. I think that the problem starts with leadership. We have to begin at the community level in our countries in the South and at the national level to show that leadership where we value what we have and we integrate it into our own development policies and strategies. I recall as a child growing up in my country, this was a deliberate effort made by the government of the day to in fact encourage university students from other parts of the Caribbean islands to come to my country to open up, to build roads, to work for months and months during their break. But not only to build a sense of community and togetherness, but to give them the sense that they're contributing tangibly to development, bringing their knowledge, bringing their skills, and they're in touch with the realities of the ground. And this, I think, is a fabulous example. A lot more of that needs to happen, and it takes leadership. I think the last point I want to make on this is, of course, that activism is very important, and that goes back to Mr. Castellanos' last intervention. I think you will get leadership, but quite often leadership responds to activism, and activism comes from within the community, the grassroots, the people, the organizations have to get themselves together and really put pressure on leaders and policymakers. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so very much. I do have a question for you, Mr. Steiner, UNDP administrator. This is very important. It says that the UNFPA, it's a question from Ms. Stefania Letta, focal point for the UNFPA, and that's what it is, working to strengthen volunteerism for programming in an effort to reach the furthest left behind and to ensure the sustainability of its programs. It has been shown that pairing young and older volunteers is mutually beneficial. What can UN agencies do more of or differently to promote that intergenerational exchange through volunteerism? What are your thoughts, sir?
Thank you, Reddy. And I think, as always, there probably isn't a very intelligent universal answer to this. You know, when I began working many years ago in what was then called the Northwest Frontier Province of Pakistan, one of the interesting things that I learned then was that volunteerism of young people was also a way to find a voice in a society that essentially, you know, begins to value the contribution in public space of people above 40 years old. And this is in no way disrespectful. I mean, there is great wisdom in the jirgas of the Pathan people, but young people essentially are excluded to some extent from a public role. So volunteerism, organizing youth clubs, and youth clubs extended to 35-year-olds at the time, was also a way of giving space or finding space. It wasn't something that was done from the outside, for people to begin to develop those leadership skills. And I think there is a lesson here that in every society, in every community, things will vary. But I think to the point of our colleague, what we can do, whether we are a local teacher or religious leader who can bring people together, or whether it is a United Nations volunteer program, for example, that can bring, these are not necessarily volunteers from another country. I mean, a great deal of volunteering in the UN takes place with nationals becoming volunteers. It is to also create visibility, to give a platform to. So sometimes, young people are overlooked and ignored. And yet at the same time, we want to have that intergenerational wisdom and at the same time perspective from young people informing decisions. So I think I would say every volunteering initiative has its own drivers, its own merits. The question is, how do we create, as our colleagues have said, an ecosystem that is supportive of volunteering? Because people can be very dismissive. You cannot, if you're very poor, create miracles with nothing. So can we find ways in which we can also target resources for volunteers to be able to be empowered to actually deliver with the energy that they bring? So let me stop here because I know you have other questions also.
Well, we're about to wrap up, actually, but I was going to give my concluding remarks. But I must ask you this. I must ask Mr. Xavier Castellanos that particular question, because you are the biggest humanitarian, volunteer humanitarian organization. I mean, this is the time of COVID. We're all trying to figure out what tomorrow looks like. Are you at all concerned? Do you have any anxieties around resources at this time? We know that economies are under pressure. It's going to take a very long time to rebuild all of this. How do you see that impacting on resources available globally for volunteerism? I'll ask that to Xavier Castellanos. What are your concerns there?
No, thank you for the question. I just wanted to first link up with the key that is looking the local volunteers as a key component of what we do. So the bottom-up approach is of a crucial importance on whatever we do. And when we link up with COVID, by all means, let me put you my first and probably something that we all might be concerned if we don't have the power of volunteering for the future, the vaccination. Once the vaccines are available, what we'll need to have is a battalion of volunteers that are going to be capable to be mobilized, to be able to mobilize in different communities, in different cities. And if there are no resources, and starting with the resources is the human capital, because this means that the human capital will require to have the skills, the knowledge, the understanding of the vaccines, what are the implications, and how to be used and promote and create the level of awareness that is needed. How to bring, again, the issue of the confidence of the communities to understand that the vaccination is going to be critical, not only for COVID, but as we know already, the vaccination loss of the past gains of 10 years are happening in these 6 months of COVID. So also the traditional vaccination immunization is going to be crucial to have volunteers move. If financial resources are not available, for this example, I am not talking about the social economic impact that are another big examples that will affect livelihoods of millions of billions of people across the world. Then is volunteering, the resources of volunteering is going to really maximize the potential to eradicate situations of health conditions that we don't want to have in the globe. And it's very much on what Camila mentioned before. The value of volunteers, the work of volunteers, if governments, the development banks, the private sector in general, the corporations will understand that by investing in volunteers, we will make a significant difference in the life and in the dignity of people, is by putting volunteers in the front line, especially now that vaccination, when it will be available, will require a battalion of people to work on.
Well, I can guarantee you that we're all going to use our different platforms, whether it's the media, whether it's the NGO space, academia, activism, corporate world, policymaking, state agencies, every single person who tuned in this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. We have to imagine the world that we want. We have to imagine the values that will drive us as people of the world. And for that to happen, let's reimagine volunteerism. Let's acknowledge all people from all corners. Let no one be left behind in terms of the skills, the expertise, and the resources, and every tool that we are going to use to create the equitable world that we want. Thank you so very much, all of you, for joining this global technical meeting, reimagining volunteerism. And I do wish you well, goodwill, health, and safety, and commitment as we go forward. Thank you so much, Ambassador Pierre, Mr. Steiner, Mr. Xavier Castellanos, Camila Sultanova, and everybody else who contributed with their insights. It was such a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Thank you so very much. Before I let you go, I do want to say, I'm inviting you to stay on for another 20 minutes. Why? There will be an interactive launch event of UN volunteers pioneering data portal on volunteerism. We need data. This is a portal. This is an innovation. The launch is featuring a very short demo of key features of the portal and what the data in there are. It would also set out plans for the next phase of activities. So again, I invite you to spend a little bit more time, 20 minutes or so, for the interactive launch event of the UNV's pioneering data portal on volunteerism. And with that, we end our session today. Thank you so very much.
The development data personally, like some of the charts that will come up at the background. This chart or the other chart. Sometimes we're flooded with so much data and charts like these that it is difficult to make sense of them quickly. Oftentimes, especially when it comes to volunteering, the data, though, is scattered or inaccessible to many. Many of you would know at least one effective policy measure on volunteering that others can replicate, or perhaps an unhealthy practice that we could all learn from. But there is yet no single global platform that pulls all of it together. How do we fill gaps in evidence? How can we collect and consolidate hundreds of important but scattered data from Argentina to Angola to Afghanistan? How can we ensure that this global evidence better informs the way that volunteering is integrated into policy solutions for the Sustainable Development Goals? By crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing a data set means building it with others. Each of you can contribute your own data points to create a data set for others to use. With all the buzz around the need for data for the SDGs, United Nations Volunteers, UNV, has created an online portal that crowdsources datasets on volunteerism. By this, we will capture a fuller picture of the global volunteering landscape, expanding beyond individual stories to solid global evidence. What legal frameworks exist to support volunteers? How is volunteering mainstreamed in legislation? How many volunteers are out there? Who are they? For this question, we combine crowdsourced and official data from national statistics offices in collaboration with our close friends from the International Labour Organization. Even if in some policy circles volunteerism is not being taken seriously, with quality data and evidence, we can change that narrative. It will not happen overnight, but this is just the start. So, dear participants, colleagues, and everyone tuned in today, let me officially launch the UNV Knowledge Portal on Volunteerism. It is UNV's key contribution to this global technical meeting, and it is the start of the global collaboration among those who collect data and those who use it to make policy. To give you a sneak peek of the portal, here is the expert, Ms. Katrina Boramel, who will now walk us through the key features of the portal and what the data is in there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Toily, for that very delightful and engaging introduction. May I just ask
Sorry.
ILO to please give me screen sharing? Okay, so I'm here to give you a very brief demo of the key features of the Knowledge Portal. Toily has probably raised your expectations on what data is in here. And now it's a moment of truth. Can we actually match these expectations? So I'm going to share my screen. Fausto. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. Okay, now we are in the Knowledge Portal. This is the Knowledge Portal, knowledge.unv.org. It has three main components: the volunteering database, the evidence library, and the knowledge exchange. But before we actually go into this very colorful and data-filled pages, I would like to have a very quick pulse test of your key data interests and needs for your work. So if you would just go to the poll section of this Zoom meeting, from the choices below, which data sets are you interested in and are most likely to use for your work? National statistics on number of volunteers by age, gender, and type, laws, policies, and schemes that promote volunteering, data on how volunteering has been integrated in the 2030 agenda, and other advocacy efforts, tools, volunteering, such as incentives and certifications. Let's see, I'll give you 10 more seconds to vote, and then we'll check out the results. And based on that, let's dive into the different pages of the portal. Okay, I'm seeing a lot on data on how volunteering has been integrated in the 2030 agenda. I'll end this poll, and you can see the results. It's on data on how volunteering has been integrated into the 2030 agenda, which is a very timely and relevant topic, as you have heard of the opening session of the GTM today. So for that, let's move to the data on the volunteering database. This is the volunteering database where we have collected data from 193 UN member states. You can see from this map, if you hover over one of the countries, you would see a very brief overview of how many volunteers there are. Has the country measured volunteering? Does the country have a piece of legislation on volunteering? And has the country mentioned volunteering in their VNRs? And then here below, you can find again, another overview where you can see how dense it is in terms of VNR reporting, how many countries have reported, and how many countries have laws and policies on volunteering. In terms of measurement work, you could see that it's still a little bit patchy with a lot of countries which have not yet measured volunteering. When we talk about integration, we mostly look at the volunteering infrastructure, which means like the suite of tools, the schemes, policies on volunteering. So let's go to the data set on laws, policies, and schemes. And here we see again another global map, which shows us that around 81 countries have a piece of legislation on volunteering itself. But when you look at the policies and schemes that integrate volunteering, you would see that there are just a few. There's a lot of gray areas here. And so you would see actually that there's a lot of data gaps that we still need to fill in. Below, you would also, we try to visualize the data. For example, in the national, sectoral, and cross-sectoral policies, what we found here is that most countries have been integrating volunteering in their efforts to empower young people, so mostly on youth. But again, 152 countries have no data. So we would really need your help there. That's why if you further move down the page, you would see here, got something to add, become an editor. So this is where we crowdsource, as Toilias mentioned earlier in his introduction, that this portal is mostly for crowdsourcing data. And another thing on integration is on the VNR reporting, the voluntary national reviews. As we are in this week of HLPF, a lot of countries have been submitting their voluntary national reviews on the progress on the SDGs. And what we have done is that from 2016 to 2019, we've collected all of those 158 reports. We've analyzed them and we've looked how many countries have mentioned volunteering in their VNRs. And we saw that there are 72 of them. And in terms of how are they integrating volunteering, like in which thematic or sectors, it's mostly on SDG 4, on education, on sustainable cities, SDG 11, and on health, SDG 3. Now, in terms of that, now we look at like who volunteers, how many volunteers are there in the world. So let's look at the data set on measurement work. And here in this measurement work, we collaborated with the International Labour Organization to collect data from national statistics offices based on a different number of sources. So they were using census, labor force survey, social survey, or time use survey. And you can see that about 95 countries have measured volunteer work at least once since 2007. And here you can see the full list of countries. And 2015, interestingly enough, was the year when a lot of countries have measured volunteer work. In terms of frequency, it's still very difficult to find that data. And in terms of how many volunteers are there, let's try to look at one country profile. Brazil is a country with over 200 million people. And ILO has worked with their national statistics offices to look at what they have collected. It's about 7,283 volunteers based on the labor force survey in 2018. And as you can see here, over 70% of their volunteers are women. And in laws and policies, they have a law since 1998, which has been amended in 2016. From Brazil, let's move to South Africa. Yeah, so South Africa has actually more data in terms of measurement. So it's disaggregated in terms of total volunteering by type. So whether the volunteering is done informally or formal or organization-based, by age group, young people, older people, or and by gender. So total volunteering by gender, direct volunteering by gender, and organization-based volunteering by gender. These are the data sources they use, the labor force survey, and you can see here that they don't have a legal framework on volunteering, but they are starting to integrate volunteering in other sectors, for example, in youth. Finally, let's try to visit another country. Let's look at Fiji, the island. So here, as I mentioned earlier, the measurement of volunteer work is still quite patchy. So Fiji is a small island. We do not have data yet on how many volunteers there are or their measurement. We also don't have much data on their legal framework, but they are starting to have a policy creating the Fiji Volunteering Service. And in terms of their VNR, last year they have actually reported and mentioned volunteering in their VNRs. So here you can see it related to SDG 11. So we have seen individual country profiles. Feel free to browse through them. We also have regional profiles. If we go, for example, to Africa, we have consolidated the data sets that we have here. Again, another overview where you can see very easily that measurement work here. Only about 11 countries in sub-Saharan Africa has measured volunteer work. And then these are the other data sets that we have collected. Let's just try to compare that with Europe. So in Europe, you would see that this stack bar is a bit more dense. Most countries have laws and policies on volunteering, have measured volunteer work, and have reported in their VNRs. So you can even filter by year here in terms of how many countries, how many volunteers are there, and then disaggregated by type, gender, and age group. And so, yeah, now that you've seen so much data, I'm sure you've had enough of this. But what do these data tell us? How do we make sense of this data? For example, if you look at this, we know that it's been repeated also in the opening session that women make up most of the world's volunteers. But what does it mean? So what we have done for this knowledge portal, we didn't just collect data, but we also tried to take a deeper dive into these thematic areas that interact with volunteering. So this is where we have the evidence library. And as I pointed out, as statistics on gender, we have created a gender page, which has a deep dive on, for example, what is the issue? Why is it relevant to volunteering? So here we looked at the complex relationship between gender and volunteering. What are the challenges and opportunities? And what is UNV actually doing? So we have identified 7 strategies to achieve gender equality through volunteering. What does the evidence say? So we also had a survey and map up the evidence on volunteering and gender. There's still a lot we don't know. That's why we're also crowdsourcing and learning from experiences. But we do know that women make up the world's volunteers, most of the world's volunteers, the gender division of tasks, and volunteering for gender equality. As we are talking about SDGs, there's a lot of themes here, but let's just look at the SDGs. We have the challenges and opportunities. What is UNV doing? What does the evidence say? Here we're focused more on the VNRs, but we would try to gather more data in terms also of the integration of volunteering in national SDG plans and strategies and linkages to specific goals, targets, and indicators. And then if you scroll further down the page, you would see the knowledge products related to these thematic areas. Let's click on the report, the Global Synthesis Report on the Plan of Action to Integrate Volunteering. We've also just launched this today, and it provides a big picture of how volunteering is currently integrated today and gives a snapshot of how volunteering can and should advance the 2030 agenda. So and then if you click further down, you can explore the evidence library, where we have identified and uploaded the top 10 evidence products per region. So you can filter that here per theme and per type. So for example, as we are talking about data earlier, we have a type called data stories. And let's just visit one of these data stories. It's on, do people volunteer differently in the 21st century? So let's quickly go through that. The changing volunteering landscape, dimensions of volunteering, categories of volunteering, and these are the 5 categories of volunteering. So I hope that gave you a very quick sneak preview of the data here in the portal. But before I actually hand over to my boss, Emma Morley, who will give you, who will unveil our big plans or exciting plans for further improving the quality of data and the features of the portal, I just like to do again another pulse check. So if you could quickly go to the poll, and based on what you have seen, which data and evidence would you like to see more of in the future? I've seen that actually you've answered the poll, which we can see that good practice on volunteering, you're looking more on the good practice on volunteering and data on how volunteering could support the specific SDGs. Emma would be able to tell you more about our plans on that. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you. And thank you to all the audience for sharing your views on what else you would like to see on the portal. It's great to see that we're off to a good start. Your feedback, inputs, and your engagement are critical to the success of this portal. As our Deputy Executive Coordinator, Mr. Toili Kubanov, mentioned, this is really just the start. The portal is a work in progress. We will always be improving and changing the portal as we go along. We will learn more about our users and adopt new technologies. For example, potentially bringing in chatbots or using machine learning for performing automated summarization tasks. I'm just throwing in some not so wild ideas out there. Artificial intelligence aside, this next half of the year, we have lined up some really exciting activities so that we can work together to have, firstly, more and better data. We will ramp up our efforts to crowdsource data and evidence on volunteering, especially focused on the Global South. Throughout August to October, we will be holding at least 5 regional virtual design labs to map data points and fill data gaps on laws, policies, schemes, as well as to collect more evidence products. Secondly, to get different views and voices, we will aim to build a strong online community of users and contributors to make sure that there's a steady drumbeat of content and a huge diversity of engagement on the portal. In fact, this October, we'll be introducing a new section called Knowledge Exchange. We're envisioning this to be more of an online consultation forum where we will convene discussions on some topics and invite guest experts and contributors. And thirdly, we want more engaging and high-quality content. From November to December, we'll be co-creating more content, data stories, and visualizations to make the sense of the quantitative data that we have all jointly collected. Stay tuned as we launch visualization challenges focused on Southern-based evidence. We'll also be convening and training a pool of online editors to help check the quality of data. I hope all of you can engage in these activities, whether as an editor, a contributor, or a regular user of the portal. These roles are in place to make sure that we have quality checks, so the data and evidence we have are valid, useful, and comprehensible to those who need and use it. Our focus is on getting a critical mass of quality data. This is really important in our policy, research, and advocacy efforts on volunteerism. So to close, we prepared a short explanatory video on how to contribute to the portal. Thank you, and I really look forward to engaging with you all.